Welcome to a new episode of the Tolkien Experience podcast. I'm Luke Shelton.
I'm Sarah Westvick.
And I'm Sarah Brown.
Each episode, we share with you an interview of a Tolkien scholar or fan.
That's right. In these interviews, one of us asks our guests to respond to 6 questions that help us learn about their personal Tolkien experience.
All of this is made possible by our supporters on Patreon. So we want to thank them and encourage you to check out the community at patreon.com/Tolkien Experience.
We are so excited to share this podcast with you. So without any more delay, let me introduce our guest. For this episode, I had the opportunity to sit down with someone who I always have a wonderful time when I end up talking with him. His name is Erik Mueller-Harder, and he is perhaps one of the nicest people in all of Tolkien fandom. He is most recognizable because he created the website Tolkienists.org. And there you can find a lot of really helpful resources if you want to do your own research into Tolkien, including the Tolkien Art Index, which is an index that has cataloged all of Tolkien's art across various publications. He also has the LR Citations Generator, which is a way to find a work in one version of The Lord of the Rings and see where that occurs in multiple other editions of The Lord of the Rings. Finally, he curates a forum there with a lot of different Tolkien scholars, fans, and experts who just really get together, have a good time, and help each other find resources or find direction for their research. So without any further ado, I want to dive right into my interview with Erik. So Erik, would you mind telling us how you were first introduced to Tolkien's work?
Well, I was 10 years old, and my dad was working with an English couple, and he came home one day and said that they had this tradition of reading this book out loud to each other every autumn. It was called The Lord of the Rings, and it apparently sounded really interesting to my dad. Again, I was 10, but he said that there was another book and told me about The Hobbit. And I went to the school library, and they had a copy of The Hobbit, and I was sold. When I finished it a day or two later, I asked the elementary school librarian, "Okay, now what?" And she pointed me then to Lewis's Narnia books, which I liked well enough. I liked very much the first time through. And then as I read them the second time, I realized that, in fact, this was Christian allegory. And I got kind of mad at Lewis at tricking me, essentially. But The Hobbit really stuck, and I kept wanting more. And my folks... my dad, I guess, gave me for Christmas the next Christmas the slip-cased Ballantine paperback set with the of the Lord of the Rings, with the decorations, illustrations by Pauline Baynes, and I was thrilled. I was so happy, and I started it. And I could not get very far. I kind of crashed and burned in chapter 2. And a month or two later, I tried again. And again, I crashed and burned in chapter 2. And I think in retrospect, this was probably happening to my dad too. Because essentially we then made a deal that we would both be reading it together, separately, but at the same time, and anyway, that seemed to do the trick. I was able to get through all the history and sort of surprising darkness there in chapter 2, and really began embracing it. And again, I was hooked. I went way ahead of Dad, and I actually played kind of a mean trick on him. This was not like me at all, and I think it's probably the influence of The Ring or something. I was devastated when we saw Gandalf fall in Moria. And I was elated, of course, when he shows up again. But after he showed up, I then essentially gave my dad a spoiler and said that Gandalf died, and because he wasn't there yet, and he was upset, he was sad, he was I think angry with me for letting on, but I never have forgotten the absolute joy on his face when he came up to my room a week or two later and said that he had gotten to the White Rider in Fangorn, and he then knew what I had done, and so on. But anyway, I absolutely loved it. One thing I liked about Lord of the Rings, even when I was still struggling to get through chapter 2, actually I read the prologue and I liked it, and I couldn't have phrased it this way, but I loved the framing that Tolkien did of himself as a historian or translator of this really old material. And so it seemed, I knew it wasn't, but I could pretend in a way that this, or even be a little bit uncertain, that this tale was real, and I really appreciated that. I liked that element of it. That's how I was introduced to Tolkien.
That's a fantastic story. There are so many questions I want to ask, but I really like your observation about basically Tolkien's framing kind of giving us permission to believe in the story in a way that a lot of authors don't necessarily do. They're just like, here's the story and you can make of it what you will. Whereas Tolkien kind of went that extra step of, let's make it a manuscript of an older story almost.
Right.
I really love that observation.
Mm-hmm. It caught me even as a kid. This maybe this is real. I like what you said about permissions. Yeah, you're reading, the C.S. Lewis, the Narnia books. There was no way I could think, oh, this really happened. They were good tales. I enjoyed them, but there was something about the historicity, I guess.
It reminds me of, Michael Drought has talked about there being textual ruins in the work, how there are bits that point to older stories. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Well, that too. I mean, I don't think I appreciated that immediately. I was in it for the tale, when I was 11. I wanted a good adventure story. I wanted there to be beings like the elves and the Ents and so on. I wanted that land to exist, the geography. But I wasn't that interested in its own in-world history of, the first and second ages so much. I found it really probably a bit bewildering. There's so very much, and within the text of the Lord of the Rings itself, there's not all that much that's explained. It's more alluded to. There are fragments of tales. A lot of it is kind of hidden in the poetry, which I tended not to skip, but kind of like Frodo in the Hall of Fires, I'd kind of half go to sleep with that and sort of have impressions of things. And by historicity, I meant of the text's life in the real world. Again, not Tolkien writing it in the 20th century, but his alluding to the fact that, the hobbits have dwindled now. We don't see them now, but very much couching things in terms of this being the same world, thousands of years later after these events that are being told in The Lord of the Rings. And I knew that wasn't true at one level, but at another level, I could just go with this and say, yeah, this is great. I love being in the same tale in a way as Sam and Frodo, even as they're talking about being in the same tale as, the figures from earlier ages.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So if that's kind of one of your favorite parts from an early reading, what is kind of your favorite part now? What continues to bring you back to The Lord of the Rings?
Well, I think there we get into more the depth of the history within the books. I am no expert in the first and second ages. I don't tend to read most of the earlier legendarium for fun and pleasure the way I do The Lord of the Rings, though I use some of those as kind of reference material. But within the context of The Lord of the Rings, I find that it adds so much depth and interest. It's not just a superficial world. Everything that Tolkien did to flesh everything out, whether it's the languages, whether it's the geography, everything that would fit into anthropology, really. This is not just a caricature or a cartoon. It's a fully realized world to a large extent, and I love that. I don't spend entire afternoons dreaming about it the way I might have in middle school, but when I turn to it and read it, it's just so satisfying. There's always more things to find in it too. I read it probably every 2 or 3 years, and I am constantly surprised with every reading. I am absolutely certain I have never read this passage before. This is so cool how this fits into the context of the chapter that it's in, but also how it echoes back to something that Tolkien wrote, many chapters earlier, or my gosh. This is actually really applicable to today's political climate or today's environmental climate or whatever. It's just a very satisfying book in so many ways. I love the language in it, not just the languages, but the language that Tolkien uses in writing it, and his absolute mastery of English at many different registers of social class, of regionalisms. If you read carefully, you can actually distinguish speech patterns from Bree from those of Hobbiton. It's amazing how much care he went to make all these things seem realistic. And I'm sure it was part of the fun for him too in writing it. But looking at King Theoden's speech, where he's talking to his troops, has so much of Middle English, alliterative verse right in his prose, right in his text. But when he's talking to Mary about pipeweed, he's just speaking at such a completely different register, these are things that I really appreciate now. I found a lot of, especially the third book, the first time or two I read this through as a kid, to be, I felt it a little stilted or, just harder to read through. And I wasn't really appreciating what Tolkien was doing quite so much. But, as I've become more sophisticated as an adult and have had more experience with earlier literature and myths and tales and so on, I see that Tolkien is echoing all this stuff, not just in what's going on in the book, but also with how he talks about what's going on and how the characters are talking. And I love that. One passage or series of passages that just hit me the other day. A couple of them have caught my eye in previous readings, but I suddenly realized a couple of days ago only that there's more to it than I'd been seeing. And this is when Mary, just after Éowyn has slain the Witch King, and Mary thinks she's dead. He's had his conversation with the dying Theoden, and there stood Meriadoc the Hobbit, his eyes blinking, and they're full of tears. There's just a couple of short paragraphs about Mary's view of the battle that's going on all around him, completely from Mary's point of view. And then it switches and it becomes much more heroic. Mary's been left behind. There's no more mention of Mary through the end of that chapter. Then there's a whole nother chapter where we're dealing with Faramir and Denethor and the pyre and everything. And then in the following chapter, we're back to Meriadoc the Hobbit blinking his tears away in the field. And there's a couple of paragraphs with Mary, and then we shift and look at Theoden being brought into the city and so on. And then briefly again, there's Mary. And we just keep coming back to Mary, and we see essentially the effect of the battle and of his experience just crystal clear. But it's almost clear, and I really need to look at Tolkien's draft manuscripts. I really want to know more about how he developed this, because it's just little jewels of paragraphs here and there throughout 3 chapters following Mary from the moment after the Witch King has been killed up through his kind of being found by Pippin in Minas Tirith. And how did he know where to put those paragraphs? How was he able to create this thing which any other author would have simply written, okay, here's a half a chapter about Mary, and then we switch over to this other thing. And that would be that. But he's tightly braided it all together. And I want to see whether he did this initially in his first drafts and it was just there, or whether he carefully rearranged things, like in a word processing document, only not. We can put this right back up here. We can move this over here. If we change these words just slightly, then it will work with the paragraphs around it, even though it's not otherwise related to them. It's just such careful craftsmanship, and this is the sort of thing I get out of it, today.
Yeah, there's just so much there that we can talk about more. I wholeheartedly agree that there's just so much in Tolkien that somehow we keep finding new and fresh ways to read him and to find that applicability that he talks about to our daily lives. And that, I think that's one of the reasons why he's still around in general.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I mean, we're recording at a time when just yesterday they announced a new movie coming out about it. So,
yes.
So people are very much interested in looking at the different ways that this can be read.
Right.
Your reflection on Mary reminded me of a paper that I wrote a couple years ago, a presentation about Eomer and the way that he behaves after Theoden's death. He says in his, he actually has alliterative verse where he says, mourn not over much, mighty was the fallen. He's telling his men, the battlefield isn't the place for grief. He says, women shall weep when we're done with the battle. But at the same exact time that he's crying this, he's crying.
Right.
And my interpretation of that is, this is Eomer saying what he has to say as the leader of his people. He is making the heroic verses that are expected of him. And that's another one of Tolkien's, no one could have made this heroic verse at the time of the battle when they're surrounded by enemies. This is something that has been transposed in, just like you're talking about with the Mary passages. But what it serves to do is to humanize Eomer, to show that while he's doing the things that are expected, he can't help but to be human. He can't help but say it through tears for the uncle / father figure that he's lost.
Right.
And as a modern reader, the way I interpret that is, hey, we need to take a look at these heroic epics and tales that we treat as history and realize that the people making them are human too. So like the people who wrote Beowulf, they probably didn't perform the same way that Beowulf did in the face of, terrifying odds. They probably were just as terrified as we would have been. And so that sounds like it really resonates with what you're talking about of he finds these ways to thread in the humanity to each of the characters throughout the battle in a way that lets us know, even though we feel like we couldn't do that, what they're doing, these characters didn't feel like they could do it either.
Yes. Absolutely. I think, and in fact, I've had a rough patch or two in my life, and I've really found that Tolkien's understanding of the humanness of his characters and of his readers, I found that to be tremendously helpful, really. One theme, of course, that goes throughout The Lord of the Rings in particular is that theory, I think it's called, of northern courage. But the idea that even in the loss of all hope, you do not despair. The despair will defeat you, but the loss of hope doesn't, and you persevere even though you feel there's no chance of success, because that's what you have to do. And that, who knows? In the novel, it's a novel. It's easy in some ways. That perseverance, does win, and the day is saved. That's not always the way it works in real life, of course. But if you despair, then you cut off that possibility of success.
Yeah. So I've officially made us dovetail into a thematic discussion instead of our questions. So I will get us back on track.
Sure.
So you've talked about, you read the story when you were about 10 years old, and then you these days revisit Tolkien's world every couple of years or so. Is there a particular time when you read Tolkien's work that it really resonates with you, that is your favorite memory to go back to of the text?
Well, we've touched on this a little bit. What I really love is the reading the text out loud. And there are a number of times in my life where that has really been bound in with my life. I had been dating the young woman who became my wife just for a few weeks, and she left the town that we were both living in, and for a prearranged work. A summer work gig. She was being a dishwasher down at a music and dance camp in Massachusetts. And it was about an hour and a half away. And I would drive down on the weekends to visit her. And we could, we had some time free when I came down. But in the evenings, she needed to essentially wash all the camp's dishes, and I was not allowed to help her because I wasn't hired for that. But I could sit in the kitchen and read aloud to her while she was doing the work that she needed to do. And this was a way of us being together. And we read some other things too, but we read The Lord of the Rings. That was the first time I read it aloud. And I don't know cause and effect, but she asked me to marry her. And the rest kind of is history. But now, as an adult, I've read it out loud, I think 4 times now, with some overlap, 3 times to each of our 2 kids. And there is very little that is like the experience of reading the entire thing out loud. First of all, there's so much to get from the book when you do that. It's everywhere through the book, there is just a wonderful cadence. There are different cadences, but you're much more aware of how the sentences flow, how the narrative flows. You're aware of alliteration, whether it's in actual verse or not. Various nuances, wordplay, things like. I think it comes up 3 times, actually, the use of the word ain't, as we pronounce it here, and in some of the British Isles, but apparently the areas where Tolkien was kind of modeling the Shire after, from research I've read, apparently at least in the late 19th century, the word would generally have been pronounced ent. And there's some lovely punning with ents and the word ent, both with Ted, Sandyman, and Sam talking in chapter 2, and then also in book 3, Treebeard himself says, I think it's something like. There are ents and ents, or there are ents and things that look like ents, but ent. And, your eyes will just gloss right over that. You won't see that if you're not reading it out loud. But it's this is now a shared experience that my kids and wife and I have all had. And, my kids are in their low 20s now, and they don't have the passion for Middle Earth that I have, and that's fine. But they love it, and they love that we've done this. And that's probably, I think, my favorite, experience or set of experiences with Tolkien's work.
Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful memory.
Absolutely, sort of ongoing memory, if you will. Tolkien in general, it's really been bound up in my life in a lot of different ways. I took a class at Harvard 10 or 12 years ago now in Tolkien, and in the anthropology department of all things. And, the class was, I think it started out as like 100 students or something. And there was a lot of attrition in the first couple of weeks as people realized how much real work was involved. But I think that it was probably 60 students or so by the time the dust settled. And there are 7 of us who, this has been a decade, there are 7 of us now who remain good, close friends. Several of them come up every year and stay with us in Vermont, and we travel to the Tolkien conference at the University of Vermont. It's 4 or 5 of us every year. But we keep in close touch throughout the year. And, I never would have met these people if it hadn't been for Tolkien. And I was able to go a couple of years ago to the Bodleian Library in Oxford. And that's where the bulk of Tolkien's papers are lovingly stored, and the other location being, of course, Marquette University in Milwaukee, where the drafts for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are. But if it's not a draft for The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, it's almost certainly at the Bodleian Library. And I was looking through a folder of some of his papers, and I stumbled across a set of correspondence with the composer, Donald Swann. Swann and Tolkien in the 60s had put together a book called The Road Goes Ever On. And Donald Swann had set a number of Tolkien's poems from The Lord of the Rings to music. It's actually wonderful stuff. My dad gave me a copy of that book when I was in high school, and I remember trying to play the piano accompaniment, to these things. But it's difficult stuff, but lovely settings, and I loved those. And I was also very familiar. I loved Donald Swann's work with Michael Flanders. They did a whole series of fairly comedic songs, several albums worth, and I had grown up listening to those and loved them. So suddenly here I was looking at the letters that Donald Swann had written to Tolkien, from the very first one saying, "Oh, I've read your book, and I love this poetry, and I would like to set some of it to music." And over a period of, 5-6 years, they actually became very close friends, and their wives as well, and would visit each other, and it was just an amazing experience to be looking at these actual letters of of Tolkien's and Swan's, with all that each of them had meant to me over the years. Just seeing them in person. This is not really Tolkien's work, I suppose, but that is also one of my fondest experiences with Tolkien.
Yeah. This kind of leads into our next question, which is, you've had all of these different experiences. Is there a way that you think that your approach to Tolkien has changed over time?
Well, yes, definitely. I think the first change would have been really when I was about 11, and I was trying to shift from having read and loved The Hobbit to the extent that I'd even tried to write a stage play of it to perform in school, and failing. To finding The Lord of the Rings so difficult to get into. And I had to shift my approach. I didn't think of it this way, but I had to sort of embrace the mystery, the depth, the darkness that I found in The Lord of the Rings, which to some extent is there in The Hobbit, but is much, much more hidden. And I had to find that appealing in order to be able to get through chapter 2. And that shift happened, and I loved it. I put the books away after high school. I think there was probably 10 or 15 years where I occasionally thought of Middle-earth, but I didn't read anything. And I'd say I probably picked up with them more or less, with the same kind of reading that I did in high school. It was reading for the tale, reading for the characters, and their friendships and so on. I think then the big shift happened when I took this course at Harvard. Again, it was offered in the anthropology department. And so there were class periods, focusing on linguistics, on toponymy, on proverbs, on maps, on more linguistics. I'd enjoyed the languages. I definitely had enjoyed the maps. I had Pauline Bain's poster map up over my bed, for years, I think. But this led me to really a different way of appreciating the depth of what Tolkien had created. So, from that point, sometimes I do a lot of work with the maps, and I have read The Lord of the Rings through looking for geographic information. That's not as fun, but it's interesting. But I'm now looking at writing style, at social register markings in dialogue, at the familiar becoming the unfamiliar as the hobbits progress east and south from the Shire, and how that's reflected linguistically and so on. A lot of those things would never have occurred to me, in high school or frankly in my 30s, really. As I was studying linguistics courses, it didn't really occur to me to apply that directly to the works, other than, of course, the regular nerdly things that people do, looking at Sindarin and Kenya and so on. But looking at the English or in the conceit, the common tongue, which is actually a different language and not English, but is translated as English. looking at that from a linguist's perspective hadn't really occurred to me.
Yeah. So with all of these experiences with Tolkien, is the work something that you recommend, and why or why not?
I'll be honest with you, Luke. When I first was listening to the first Tolkien Experience podcasts that you've done, and we got to this question, my thought was, oh, that's a silly question, to ask of the people that you'd be having as guests. Who's not going to recommend Tolkien, right? So it seemed a little odd in a way, really. But specifically, when I heard your interview, Sarah's interview with Verlyn Flieger the other week, and she said a very emphatic no. She doesn't recommend it. And what? What? And of course, I listened to her reasoning on that and what she meant. But it caused me to reflect a little bit about my kind of glib answer of, well, yeah, of course. And I thought about it. And in fact, I'm not changing my mind. I'm just realizing that, in fact, I don't recommend it. I'm not sure I've ever recommended it. People know of my fascination with it and that it occupies a large portion of my attention. And in many ways, I live it. And so nobody's certainly going to be asking me, would I recommend it? They know. They know that I think that there's something special here. If somebody asked me, of course, I would explain some of the things we've talked about here today. What I see in this, its applicability, which I think is absolutely as great as, say, Shakespeare. Its language, its construction, and many things. I guess one thing that I have been asked a number of times is my child old enough for, say, The Hobbit? And I always answer yes. If they're old enough to be interested, they're certainly old enough to read it or be read to from it. It seems to me. I read it to our older child at age 4, and he loved it. And I guess the other question I get asked sometimes is, okay, my child loved The Hobbit, but are they old enough now for The Lord of the Rings? And essentially, I say the same thing again. I say yes. If they're old enough to be interested in it, they're old enough to read it or have it read to them. I would warn that it's going to be different from The Hobbit. I would warn that there's a couple of, difficult patches. If I'm reading it aloud, I'll do my best to sort of explain things in chapter 2 as we make our way through it. And then especially when we get to the Council of Elrond, which I think is a masterfully written chapter. It's absolutely amazing how Tolkien brings so many people together and so many reported stories, second and third hand, all being related. And if you keep your wits about you, it actually isn't that difficult to read or follow what's going on. So if you're reading it aloud to a youngster, give them signposts, try to use different voices as names crop up, remind them who they are, that sort of thing, just to give them a little help. And it's really not that hard. And I would let them opt out. If they've stopped if they're not interested, don't try to force it on them. But some parents I've heard have been worried that it glorifies violence or glorifies warfare, and I think really nothing could be further from the truth. As we were talking about earlier, it occurs during a war. There are battle scenes, but it absolutely doesn't glorify that, even as it speaks heroically at times, and people can act heroically. I read it as predominantly almost anti-war, but at least with a strong feeling for what the effects of war are on individuals and on nations. He certainly was no stranger to that, and I think it comes through pretty clearly in the work. But I don't know. You've actually studied a lot about kids and their readings of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. What do you think? Do you recommend it?
Well, my response is about the same as yours. It's, your kids best. If you feel like they're ready for it, then they probably are. I do say, be aware of what is in the book. There are battle scenes. There is violence, even though, like you said, it's not really glorified. But, if you think that your child is okay with that level of violence, that's fine. As you said in my research, I discussed Lord of the Rings with younger viewers. The youngest who participated in the study was 7.
Wow.
And they loved the Lord of the Rings, and were actively trying to find other ways to engage with the Lord of the Rings outside of the book.
Wow.
So I will also say that that participant had older siblings, and so it might have been all my siblings love Lord of the Rings, so I do too, kind of thing.
Yeah, sure.
But that 7-year-old certainly enjoyed the story, and I often find that parents are really concerned about they're not going to get everything. Well, of course not. They're not going to get everything. I don't get everything every time I read it.
Well said. Yes. Right.
So, they can get enough to enjoy it, or as you said, they can opt out if at some point they decide, I don't think this is for me. Okay. So I basically have the same answer as you.
Yeah. Well, I think back to my first reading, through it. There's so much I didn't get. Honestly, for maybe the first half of my first reading, I thought Mary was female, because Mary's a female name, and the fact that the pronoun was wrong, it just didn't. I didn't see it. There's a lot you don't get the first time, no matter how old you are. I think it doesn't mean that you can't enjoy it, or get things out of it. I think there's so much going on at so many levels that there's something there for almost anybody.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, I've realized I don't recommend it.
Well, thank you so much for a great interview. The last question I have for you is, what are you working on now that our listeners could engage with?
Well, it is an interesting time. So I'm working on a book on Tolkien's draft maps for the Lord of the Rings, his working maps. He made probably dozens of maps as he was trying to work things out. Some of them just tiny little sketches of 4 or 5 lines representing the road from Bree to Rivendell. Others fantastically complicated and complex, and with amazing histories of their own that show all of Middle Earth as he was developing it over good 6 or 8 year period. So the book would have reproductions of these maps. I'm not aware of any that haven't already been reproduced, but this would collect them all together. And then would also include my own redrawings of the maps. With the complicated ones, it would show various stages in the map's own history and say, okay, this first map of the west of Middle Earth, the first one he made, here's what it would have looked what it would have looked like, after about a year of his working on it. Here's what it looked like a year or two later, and so on, at various stages. And then probably also including my own drawings of, in a consistent manner, showing precisely what was on the original map, but in a consistent style from map to map. Tolkien tried many different styles for various reasons, but it does make them a little difficult to compare in terms of what's on them. So this would follow that whole kind of historical progression of Tolkien's geographic vision of Middle Earth from when he first began working on it, right after The Hobbit was published, or even earlier, actually. The Wilderland map from The Hobbit does count. And so following from there, right up through his son Christopher's redrawings of the maps for inclusion in the first editions of The Lord of the Rings. And then hopefully also another volume after that, which itself would simply be a full-color Middle-earth atlas and gazetteer, basically kind of a modern, more colorful version of Karen Wynne Fonstad's work from the 80s, the Atlas of Middle-earth. So that's one large project. In the shorter term, though, I'm working on completely rewriting the Tolkienists.org website. So in my map work, I've at various times needed tools that didn't exist. So I needed a shorthand way of referring unambiguously to different passages in The Lord of the Rings. So because I needed that, I created LR Citations, which is online and you can get to it from the Tolkienists website. And then similarly, I've needed a list of all of his Middle-earth related artwork and maps. And that actually became the Tolkien Art Index, which you can also get from the Tolkienists website. The website itself is, the point is to list many things that have sort of just happened. So if there's Tolkien-related news, Tolkien-related books, issues of Tolkien-related journals such as Malorn, the website will show those kind of as they happen, including lists of the articles or the chapters in them, the authors' names, and so on, completely cross-referenced and so on. It also includes excerpts of the blogs of many Tolkien researchers as they're published, with their permission, of course. Then looking into the future, it also shows sort of upcoming book releases, calls for papers for conferences and so on, conference announcements, and that sort of thing. All of which I'm sort of collecting because I find them useful, and there's not kind of one place to find it all. So unfortunately, I found that that's rather time consuming doing it the way that I originally set up. So my actual background is in IT and software development. So I am currently completely writing my own customized backend for this, which will make it much, much, much easier to ongoingly just enter this information very quickly each day, so it always stays up to date. It's actually, I'm using a new tool, and I had some apprehensions, but it's going really well. So I'm hoping that actually the rewrite will be done, and there will be at least some good current new information on the Tolkienist website using that new backend at about the time you'd be hearing this podcast, I think. And then finally, there's one other project that has just come up, which I really can't talk about at this point, but it may put everything else on hold. And it's really exciting, and I wish I could say anything about it. But I will say that it's possible that there will be several trips to Milwaukee in my future.
Well, that's very exciting. For those of you who don't know, Milwaukee is where Marquette is, as Erik was saying earlier. Sorry for taking so much of your time, but it has been a wonderful chance to talk with you. So I just want to thank you once again for a fantastic interview.
Oh, Luke, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've been listening to the podcast ongoingly and have really enjoyed it. And it's just a real treat to actually get to talk with you and do it ourselves.
We are so thankful that we have such gracious scholars and fans who want to share their Tolkien experience with us and with you.
We really enjoy making these podcasts, and the fun doesn't stop here.
That's right, it continues on social media. You can find us on Facebook as Tolkien Experience and Twitter as @TolkienEXP. Don't forget to like, follow, share and comment, because we love interacting with you just as much as we enjoy talking to our guests.
For even more content and to join our fellowship of supporters, check out our Patreon by going to patreon.com/Tolkien Experience. Finally, you can also follow our personal Twitter accounts. I'm @Luke B. Shelton.
I'm @SR Westvic.
And I'm @Aaron L. Palmadill. If you have questions or comments, you can send them to us by email at tolkienexperience@gmail.com.
If you want to know more about this week's guest, we provide show notes at tolkienexperience.com. You can find the podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple, Stitcher, and YouTube. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast wherever you listen to it.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we truly hope that, in a way, it contributes to your own Tolkien experience.